Chapter 26, Digestive System, Part 1, Screencast 3. Now, this final screencast for Part 1 will focus on the stomach. And remember, this is the last structure that we cover that is part of the upper GI. We also will talk about a number of reflexes and different types of control overall for digestion. Now, the stomach, it's located in the upper left abdominal quadrant, and it is directly inferior to the diaphragm. Within the stomach, we're going to see both chemical and mechanical digestion, and this is also an area where we first start to see protein being digested. There is some fat, but not to a great degree, so that's not often something that I refer to. So if it comes to asking what is being digested in the stomach, the expectation is that you'll answer protein. Now, when we talk about how long foodstuff will spend in the stomach, it can be anywhere from 2 to 6 hours. Now, absorption is limited to small, nonpolar substances. So one of the things that actually is absorbed through the stomach is alcohol. And so it's not uncommon when some people are going to drink, they will actually consume something first in an effort to kind of slow down the absorption of alcohol. The stomach actually serves as a holding bag and is controlling the release of partially digested material into the small intestine, and that would be the duodenum. I quite often like thinking of the stomach as a cement truck. And kind of imagine you see a cement truck on the road and it's twirling, it's moving, and it's responsible for actually mixing. Now, this image here is basically looking at the general anatomy of the stomach, but what I do want to point out is the muscularis. So this is where there is a big departure from the rest of the GI tract. And take note that within the stomach, there is an oblique layer, a circular layer, and a longitudinal layer. Now, keep in mind, the oblique is new, and that is due to the fact that now, remember, force is generated in the direction in which fibers are going. So now with this additional layer, we see a different movement with respect to this oblique layer. And the oblique layer is actually the innermost. So here we have the oblique, circular, and the longitudinal layer in that order from innermost to outermost. Now, when we look at the histology of the stomach, what really is going to characterize the stomach is what we refer to as gastric pits. So these are these indentations, okay? And if you were to look at a slide that has both the distal esophagus and the beginning of the stomach, you'll see a really interesting transition that is characterized by these gastric pits. Now, within the gastric pits, we find gastric glands. And these are glands that extend deep into the mucosa from the base of each gastric pit. It is partially surrounded by muscularis mucosa, which will help expel gastric secretions. Now, when we look at the histology, once again, primarily the muscularis, we have 3 smooth layers, not 2. The inner oblique, which is a middle circular outer longitudinal. The third layer assists churning and blending, and it thickens as it progresses from the body of the stomach to the pylorus. The visceral peritoneum, which is a serosa, is the outermost layer of the stomach wall. Now, this is an important image, and I do want to put an emphasis on the gastric pits and glands. One of the things that you will be responsible for are these structures and their secretions. The first is going to be the surface mucus cell, and these secrete an alkaline fluid containing mucin. We have mucous neck cells. These actually secrete an acidic fluid containing mucin. Now, 2 cells that quite often get flip-flopped are parietal and chief. The parietal cells, these actually secrete 2 substances, and they are intrinsic factor and hydrochloric acid. The chief cells actually will be secreting pepsinogen and some gastric lipase, but we're going to think of the primary job of the chief cell is to secrete pepsinogen. Then there are G cells, and these are enteroendocrine cells, and they are responsible for the secretion of gastrin into the blood. Now, as noted, what I think is especially important is to know the gastric secretions and what cell they originate from. We've already addressed that there are 5 types of secretory cells. 4 actually produce gastric juice, and the 5th actually will be secreting the hormone gastrin. First are surface mucus cells. These actually line the stomach lumen, and they extend into the gastric pits. They are continuously secreting an alkaline fluid that contains mucin. So what this does, the mucus layer actually helps to prevent ulceration of the stomach and really preventing it from gastric enzymes and the high acidity. When we talk about the acidity of high chloric acid, it is especially low, so very acidic. Now, the mucus neck cells, these are immediately deep to the base of the gastric pit. They're interspersed among the parietal cells, and they actually produce an acidic mucin, and they are responsible for maintaining an acidic condition. We'll talk about why that's important. Now, both types of mucus cells have the job of protecting the lining of the stomach from abrasion and injury. Now, the parietal cells are adding 2 substances to gastric juices. One is intrinsic factor, and that is required for the absorption of vitamin B12, which takes place within the ileum. Vitamin B12 is especially necessary for the production of normal erythrocytes. There's actually an anemia that's associated with vitamin B12 deficiency. The other substance is going to be hydrochloric acid. Now remember, hydrochloric acid is a strong acid, and it is going to be secreted across the surface of the cell, and it is responsible for the low pH we find within the stomach. The functions of hydrochloric acid are to break down plant cells and animal connective tissue, things that we really don't have the enzymes to digest, denaturing proteins, which is going to facilitate the chemical digestion of proteins later on in the small intestine. Also, this hydrochloric acid is converting pepsinogen into the active pepsin, and we'll talk about this when we actually talk about the chief cells. The other thing to keep in mind here is microorganisms do not well in an acidic environment, so that is the other function that is associated with hydrochloric acid, an immune function to actually kill microorganisms. Now, I'm not going to put a lot of emphasis at all on the formation of hydrochloric acid from parietal cells, so this is actually something that we can skip. Now, the chief cells, these are the most numerous cells within the gastric glands, and they produce packages of zymogen granules. Now remember, zymogens are not going to be active. They are produced in an inactive form, and they are mostly made up of pepsinogen. So once again, that GEN ending that we have seen numerous times indicates that in this form, pepsinogen is inactive. So it is the precursor of pepsin. So for pepsinogen to be activated, it must actually be exposed to an acidic environment. Now, it makes sense that pepsin will be inactive, and this is to prevent destruction of the chief cell proteins. Pepsinogen, activated by hydrochloric acid and other active pepsin molecules, this is responsible for the digestion of proteins, mostly denatured, into oligopeptides. Now, also, we'll be looking at gastric lipase, and once again, not a lot of lipid digestion is going on here. So, from my standpoint, we will only be referring to the digestion of protein occurring within the stomach. So, the majority of lipid digestion will occur within the small intestine. Now, there also are G cells, and these are enteroendocrine cells that are widely distributed within the gastric glands. They secrete the hormone gastrin. And gastrin, unsurprisingly, is going to be a hormone responsible for the stimulation of stomach secretions and also gastric motility. Now, there are other types of enteroendocrine cells that produce other hormones, and one would be somatostatin, but once again, this is just given as an example and not something that you are responsible for on the 5th unit exam covering the digestive system and the reproductive systems. Now here we basically have an image of the gastric secretions. We basically see the gastric gland releasing gastrin into the hormone. We also see the parietal cells and note that they are releasing hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. We can see various types of mucin. We can see pepsinogen being inactive coming from the chief cells and actually being activated by the hydrochloric acid into its active form, pepsin. And remember, hydrochloric acid will be denaturing proteins, and pepsin will actually be taking those denatured proteins and digesting them into smaller oligopeptides. Now, when we look at the motility associated with the stomach, there are two functions going on. One, mixing of the bolus to form chyme and emptying chyme from the stomach to the small intestine. So we have something known as gastric mixing, and this is something that we have alluded to previously as the importance of the mixing process. Mixing is a mechanical digestion. And what's happening now is we have this bolus that is now semi-digested, and as it mixes with the slurry of gastric secretions, it now forms chyme. So thinking of chyme as a slurry is really the best way to approach it. And once again, this churning and mixing leads to the reduction in the size of particles that have been ingested. Now, gastric emptying. This is the movement of the acidic chyme from the stomach into the duodenum. Now, there's a pressure gradient that moves contents towards the pylorus, and this is the distal stomach. This gradient increasing force against the pyloric sphincter. The sphincter opens, and along with that opening is a small volume of chyme. The sphincter closes, and as it closes, there's something known as retropulsion. This reverses the flow of stomach contents back towards the stomach and results in more mixing. So this is really an ongoing process. So one, we see the contraction of smooth muscle in the stomach wall. It's mixing the bolus with gastric secretions to form chyme, and that's really what we think of as the slurry. There are peristaltic waves causing a pressure gradient that moves the contents of the stomach towards the pyloric region, and so we have the distal portion of the stomach. Now that pressure gradient increases force within the pylorus against the pyloric sphincter. That sphincter is going to open, and a small amount of chyme will move its way into the duodenum. And as it closes, there's retropulsion, and we can see that here, and that results in further mixing. Now, when we look at the regulation of digestive processes within the stomach, we already have referred to the stomach as a holding bag for partially digested food until food is moved into the small intestine where digestion is completed. Now, keep in mind these movements that are taking place within the stomach are very coordinated. So we will find pacemaker cells. Now, pacemaker cells were addressed previously. And when we start thinking about pacemaker cells, coordinated contraction, and gap junctions, those typically we associate with the heart. But this is not the case. Digestive processes are especially coordinated, so we're going to find pacing cells, we're going to find gap junctions. So pacemaker cells, once again, they're responsible for spontaneously depolarizing and establishing the rhythm associated with muscular contraction within the stomach. Now, the signals will spread through smooth muscle cells and muscularis layers, and this is happening via the gap junctions. Now, force of contraction and gastric gland secretion, this is regulated by nervous reflexes and hormones. Now, there are three phases that are going on here, and we will refer to them as the cephalic phase, the gastric phase, and the intestinal phase. Now, this is an important diagram that basically walks through the three phases. So first is the cephalic phase, and that is actually initiated by thought, smell, sight, or the taste of food, or even the sounds of food preparation. Receptors, so typically this is going to be our special senses, primarily our nose and eyes, are going to increase nerve signals relayed from the cerebral cortex and the hypothalamus to the medulla oblongata. The medulla is going to integrate input from higher brain centers, and the output will be increased nerve signals relayed along the vagus nerve from the medulla to the stomach. The effector in this case will be the stomach, and it is going to be stimulated to increase both its force of contraction and the release of gastric juice. The gastric reflex, this is initiated by presence of food within the stomach. Receptors are going to be baroreceptors within the wall of the stomach, and as food enters the stomach, it's going to distend, and these baroreceptors will be activated. Chemoreceptors will be detecting the different types of food, the pH, in the stomach. This input results in increased nerve signals that are going to the medulla. The medulla will integrate the sensory input, and there's going to be an increase in motor output through the vagus nerve to the stomach, and the effector, once again, will be the stomach, and it's stimulated to increase both its force of contraction and the release of secretions. In addition, presence of the food within the stomach will release gastrin. This will target the stomach to increase both its force of contraction and also the release of secretions, especially hydrochloric acid. Gastrin also stimulates contraction of the pyloric sphincter. The last phase is the intestinal reflex, and this is initiated by acidic chyme in the duodenum. Within the duodenum, there are chemoreceptors in the intestinal wall that detect the acidic chyme or low pH in stomach contents. There is decreased nerve signals relayed to the medulla oblongata. This medulla will integrate sensory input. Now, the motor output, note, there's now decreased nerve signals that are relayed along the vagus nerve from the medulla to the stomach. Now, the stomach will be inhibited to decrease both its force of contraction and the release of secretions found in gastric juice. In addition, the presence of fatty chyme in the duodenum, this causes the release of cholecystokinin or CKK. This will decrease the force of contraction within the stomach. The presence of acidic chyme also causes the release of secretin, and this will also inhibit release of stomach secretion. So both hormones that are produced within the small intestine actually feed back and decrease gastric activity, both secretions and motility. Now, there are a number of clinical situations that are tied into the stomach. One is gastric bypass. Originally, this was thought of to be an elective procedure and not covered by insurance companies. This is an effective surgical treatment for obesity. And when I'm talking about obesity, usually we will see morbid obesity. In this procedure, a small part of the stomach is sectioned off and is attached to the lower part of the small intestine. This results in a decrease in the number of nutrients absorbed, a reduction in appetite, and an altered response to hormones like insulin. And one thing that we do see in individuals that undergo this procedure, generally, if you are morbidly obese, you have type 2 diabetes. What happens to this particular, as a result of this procedure, is a remission of type 2 diabetes, and this happens within a few days of the surgical procedure. Now, this is the ultimate reason why insurance companies will now pay for this procedure. Insurance companies are all of a sudden not going to be supportive and pay for elective procedures. There has to be something in it for them. And for them, it's a cost-benefit ratio. It is much more financially positive for them to actually pay for a surgical procedure as opposed to the cost associated with the treatment of type 2 diabetes. Now, peptic ulcers, this is erosion of the stomach or the duodenum, and keep in mind this is going to be due to the acidic contents. And what might happen, gastric ulcers within the stomach and duodenal ulcers, which are in the duodenum, and now you have a gnawing, burning pain in the epigastric region. This results in nausea, vomiting, and bleeding. Now, the real issue here is the erosion and perforation, and this would be considered a medical emergency. Now, we have these bacteria, and they also can cause erosion of the gastric lining. And the treatment here is basically the same as gastric reflux. Now we also have vomiting. Now this is a rapid expulsion of contents of the stomach through the oral cavity. There is actually a vomiting center within the medulla oblongata, and this will respond to motion sickness, head injury, infection, food irritation, and toxicity. Now, during this process, there's a closure of the nasal passages and the glottis. There is forceful contraction of skeletal muscle, and that creases or results in a greater intragastric pressure. And now the contents of the stomach are forced into and through the esophagus. Now, one of the real concerns of vomiting is the danger of aspiration. And we do know that some individuals potentially, depending upon their level of consciousness, can actually aspirate or choke on the vomit, and that could result in death.